Eight is Enough may have redefined the family drama genre in late 1970s television, but behind the warmth of the Bradford family home was a cast marked by heartbreak, devastating loss, and tragedy that mirrored none of the show's feel-good endings. Fame did not save them. In fact, for some, it became a gilded cage that magnified their personal demons, while for others, it arrived too late or departed too soon, leaving them grasping at memories of relevance. Nearly 45 years later, their stories remain so haunting that once you hear them, you'll never watch this beloved classic the same way again. The laughter that filled living rooms across America each week masked tears shed in hospital rooms, addiction treatment centers, and lonely apartments where former stars wondered if anyone still remembered their names. This is not the story ABC wanted you to know. This is the real Eight is Enough, where eight was never truly enough to shield them from life's cruelest blows. Diana Hyland, Joan Bradford. Diana Hyland was born on January 25, 1936, in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. She was 40 years old when she stepped into the role of Joan Bradford, the warm and nurturing mother at the heart of the Bradford family, though she would appear in only 4 episodes before tragedy struck. By the time Eight is Enough began production in 1977, Hyland was already an accomplished actress with a career spanning 2 decades, including an Emmy Award for her work on Peyton Place. Yet she was about to face a battle no amount of professional success could help her win. But behind the seasoned professionalism and graceful screen presence lay a woman fighting a silent war. In 1977, just as Eight is Enough was beginning to film, Hyland was diagnosed with breast cancer. She kept the diagnosis private, determined not to let her illness derail the show or her career. At the same time, she had found unexpected love with a much younger actor named John Travolta, who was then 23 to her 41 years. Their relationship, which began on the set of the TV movie The Boy in the Plastic Bubble, brought her genuine happiness during what would become the darkest chapter of her life. Travolta adored her, and she him, but even love's most powerful force couldn't stop what was coming. As filming progressed through early 1977, Hyland's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer spread with devastating speed, and despite aggressive treatment, her body weakened week by week. The production team scrambled to right around her absence, and the cast watched helplessly as their fictional matriarch fought a losing battle off-screen. Travolta rarely left her side, staying with her at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles as she slipped away. The show that was supposed to launch a new chapter in her career instead became a cruel reminder of time running out. Diana Hyland died on March 27, 1977, at the age of 41, just 8 days after the series premiered on ABC. The cause was breast cancer, a disease that consumed her in less than a year from diagnosis to death. Her final episodes aired as America fell in love with the Bradford family, unaware that the woman playing their mother was already gone. Travolta was devastated, later calling her the love of my life, and the show was forced to rewrite its entire premise around her absence. A tragic fate for someone who had finally found both professional opportunity and personal joy, only to have everything stolen away in a matter of months. Dick Van Patten, Tom Bradford. Richard Vincent Van Patten was born on December 9, 1928, in Kew Gardens, New York. He was 48 years old when he stepped into the role of Tom Bradford, the patient and wise newspaper columnist, father of 8 children, a character that would define his career and make him a household name. Van Patten had been a working actor since childhood, appearing on Broadway at age 7, but 8 is Enough represented his first true shot at television stardom after decades of supporting roles. Yet beneath the wholesome father figure persona lived a man who struggled with self-doubt and the gnawing fear that success had come too late. Van Patten had spent 30 years in the entertainment industry without ever achieving leading man status, and when Eight is Enough finally gave him that opportunity, he was haunted by the possibility it would disappear as quickly as it arrived. His insecurities were compounded by the sudden death of Diana Hyland, which cast a shadow over the show's early days and reminded everyone involved how fragile life could be. Van Patten threw himself into the role with workaholic intensity, terrified that if he slowed down, the industry would forget him again. As the years passed and Eight is Enough ended its run in 1981, Van Patten found himself typecast as the eternal father figure, unable to escape Tom Bradford's shadow. He worked steadily in television, movies, and guest appearances, but the leading roles never materialized. Financial pressures mounted as he tried to support his family on residuals and supporting parts. He invested in a pet food business, Natural Balance Pet Foods, which eventually became successful, but not before years of financial strain. His health began to fail in the 2000s, with diabetes complications that required constant management. The man who had played the picture of paternal strength was slowly being broken down by the very ordinary struggles of aging and illness. Dick Van Patten died on June 23, 2015, at the age of 86 from diabetes complications. He passed away at St. John's Health Center in Santa Monica, surrounded by family but largely forgotten by an industry that had once made him a star. The obituaries remembered him fondly as the dad from Eight is Enough, a bittersweet epitaph for a man who had worked in entertainment for nearly 8 decades, a tragic fate for someone who finally achieved fame only to realize it was fleeting, leaving him to spend his final years grasping at the edges of relevance while his body slowly betrayed him. Adam Rich, Nicholas Bradford. Adam Rich was born on October 12, 1968, in Brooklyn, New York. He was 8 years old when he stepped into the role of Nicholas Bradford, the youngest and most adorable of the Bradford children, whose page boy haircut became iconic and made him one of the most recognizable child stars of the late 1970s. Rich's cherubic face and precocious charm made him a fan favorite, but the early fame would ultimately become a weight too heavy for him to carry. But behind the innocent smile and those big brown eyes was a child being thrust into an adult world with no preparation for what came next. Rich's parents pushed him hard, and the pressures of being a child star began to manifest early. As Eight is Enough continued its successful run, Rich struggled with the normal challenges of growing up while also dealing with the extraordinary circumstances of being recognized everywhere he went. The show made him wealthy and famous, but it also robbed him of a normal childhood. When the series ended in 1981, Rich was only 12 years old, already a has-been in an industry that chewed up child actors and spit them out when they lost their cuteness. As the years passed through the 1980s and 1990s, Rich's life spiraled into darkness. He struggled with depression and drug addiction, self-medicating to cope with the loss of identity that came when the cameras stopped rolling. He was arrested multiple times, including for attempted burglary and driving under the influence. In 1991, he nearly died from an accidental overdose of prescription medication, a suicide attempt according to some reports, though Rich later denied it. He bounced between rehab facilities and brief acting gigs, never able to recapture the magic of his childhood success. The industry that had celebrated his cuteness offered little support when that child grew into a troubled man searching for purpose beyond Nicholas Bradford. Adam Rich died on January 7, 2023, at the age of 54. He was found dead in his Los Angeles home, with the cause of death later determined to be from fentanyl intoxication, an accidental overdose. The news shocked fans who remembered the little boy with the page boy haircut, now gone in circumstances that tragically echoed the struggles he'd battled for decades. A cruel twist for someone whose childhood brought joy to millions, but whose adulthood was marked by addiction, depression, and the suffocating shadow of a character he could never escape. He died alone, far from the warm Bradford family home that had once defined his existence. Willie Ames, Tommy Bradford. Willie Ames was born Albert William Upton on July 15, 1960, in Newport Beach, California. He was 16 years old when he stepped into the role of Tommy Bradford, the second youngest son known for his athletic prowess and occasional teenage rebellion, a character that made Ames a teen idol during the show's 5-season run. Before Eight is Enough, Ames had already been working steadily as a child actor, but this role elevated him to heartthrob status with millions of young fans. Yet beneath the golden California boy image lived a teenager dealing with the intoxicating and destructive combination of early fame and absent parental guidance. Ames was making significant money during Eight is Enough's run, but he was also being exposed to the darker sides of Hollywood at a vulnerable age. The pressures of maintaining his teen idol image while navigating actual adolescence created fractures in his psyche that would widen with time. After the show ended, Ames transitioned to other roles, most notably in the 1980s series Charles in Charge, alongside Scott Baio, but his personal life was already beginning its descent into chaos. As the years passed through the late 1980s and 1990s, Ames's life collapsed spectacularly. He developed serious drug and alcohol addictions, blowing through the fortune he'd earned as a young actor. His first marriage ended in divorce, and his financial situation became so dire that he declared bankruptcy in 1990, owing hundreds of thousands of dollars. He lived in his car at one point, a former teen idol sleeping in parking lots and trying to figure out where everything went wrong. He attempted a comeback by working in Christian entertainment, including their religious superhero series Bibleman, but the shadow of addiction and financial ruin followed him. His health deteriorated from years of substance abuse, and his relationships remained fractured. Willie Ames did not die, but his story carries its own form of tragedy, the slow death of identity and dignity. Now 65 years old, he works as a cruise ship activities director, a job light years away from the spotlight that once defined him. He has spoken openly about his struggles with addiction and financial collapse, offering cautionary tales to other former child stars. A heartbreaking decline for someone who once had everything a teenager could want: fame, money, adoration, only to lose it all to demons he couldn't control. The industry that made him a heartthrob turned its back when he was no longer profitable, leaving him to rebuild a life from the wreckage of broken dreams. Lanny O'Grady, Mary Bradford. Lonnie O'Grady was born Lainey Sue Wells on October 2, 1954 in Walnut Creek, California. She was 22 years old when she stepped into the role of Mary Bradford, the eldest daughter known for her responsible nature and occasional romantic storylines, a character that resonated with viewers who saw her as the reliable sister everyone wished they had. O'Grady came from a show business family. Her mother was a talent agent, and acting seemed like her natural destiny, but fate had much darker plans. But behind the composed eldest daughter facade was a woman battling severe anxiety and panic disorders that would torment her throughout her life. O'Grady's mental health struggles began in her teens and intensified during 8 Is Enough's run, though she hid them masterfully from cast, crew, and viewers. The pressure of being on a hit show exacerbated her conditions, and she began self-medicating with alcohol and prescription drugs to cope with panic attacks that could strike without warning. Her relationships suffered as her internal battles intensified, and even as Mary Bradford was finding happiness on screen, Lanny O'Grady was drowning in psychological torment off-screen. As the years passed after 8 Is Enough ended in 1981, O'Grady's life became a devastating cycle of treatment, relapse, and isolation. She struggled to find substantial work after the show, landing only occasional guest appearances that reminded her of what she'd lost. Her addiction to prescription medications deepened as she tried to self-treat. Her anxiety and depression, and she cycled through multiple rehab stays that never seemed to stick. She became reclusive, avoiding former castmates and distancing herself from the industry that had once embraced her. Her family watched helplessly as she spiraled, unable to break through the walls she'd built around her suffering. The beautiful young woman who had played the reliable Bradford daughter became a ghost haunting her own life. Lonnie O'Grady died on September 25, 2001, at the age of 46. She was found dead in her mobile home in Valencia, California, the victim of an accidental overdose from a combination of prescription medications, Vicodin and Prozac, that she had been using to treat her chronic anxiety and depression. She had been dead for several days before her body was discovered, dying alone in circumstances that reflected the isolation that had defined her final years. A tragic fate for someone whose on-screen character represented stability and warmth. While her real life was marked by psychological torment she could never escape. Mental illness doesn't care about fame, and in O'Grady's case, fame may have actually accelerated her decline, trapping her in a prison of expectations she could never meet. Betty Buckley, Abby Bradford. Betty Lynn Buckley was born on July 3, 1947, in Big Spring, Texas. She was 30 years old when she stepped into the role of Abby Bradford, the stepmother who replaced Diana Hyland's Joan after her tragic death, a challenging position that required winning over viewers who were still mourning the original matriarch. Buckley was a trained stage actress and singer who brought theatrical gravitas to the role, but joining Eight is Enough under such circumstances created an impossible situation marked by grief and resentment. Yet beneath her professional composure lived a woman dealing with the complicated emotions of replacing a dead colleague while also trying to establish her own identity within an already established television family. Buckley faced resistance from some cast members who felt protective of Hyland's memory, and from viewers who saw her as an unwelcome replacement rather than a character in her own right. The psychological weight of stepping into a dead woman's shoes, both literally and figuratively, took a toll that Buckley rarely discussed publicly. She threw herself into the role with fierce determination, but the shadow of Diana Hyland's tragic death hung over every scene she filmed, a constant reminder that she was filling a space created by loss. As the years passed, Buckley managed to avoid the tragic downfalls that claimed many of her castmates, instead building a successful career in theater, particularly in musical productions like Cats, where she originated the role of Grisabella and sang Memory to acclaim. However, her personal life carried its own quiet sorrows, failed relationships, and the constant struggle of working in an industry that valued youth over experience. She watched from a distance as former castmates like Adam Rich and Lenny O'Grady spiraled into addiction and death. Survivor's guilt mixing with relief that she had somehow escaped their fates. The joy of her theatrical success was always tinged with the memory of those who hadn't made it out alive. Betty Buckley is still alive at 77 years old, but her story is included here as a testament to survival tinged with sorrow. She escaped the tragic endings that claimed others, but she carried the weight of stepping into a role created by death, of watching castmates destroy themselves, and of navigating an industry that often felt like a minefield of potential destruction. Her Eight is Enough experience, while ultimately successful, was marked by a darkness that no amount of later triumph could fully erase. A bittersweet fate for someone who survived where others didn't, but who must live with the memories of those who fell forever. Wondering why she was spared when so many others were not. Grant Goodeve, David Bradford. Grant Goodeve was born on July 6, 1952, in Middlebury, Connecticut. He was 24 years old when he stepped into the role of David Bradford, the eldest son and aspiring architect whose maturity and level-headedness made him a stabilizing force within the chaotic Bradford household. Goodeve was relatively unknown when he was cast, and Eight is Enough represented his big break. But the path after the show ended would prove far more challenging than the comfortable television family he was leaving behind. But behind the responsible eldest son character was a young man acutely aware that his moment in the spotlight was temporary and that the industry had little use for actors who became too associated with a single role. Goodeve watched as the show's success peaked and then ended, knowing that his face was now indelibly linked to David Bradford in ways that would make casting directors hesitant to see him as anyone else. After Eight is Enough concluded, he struggled to find substantial work, landing occasional television appearances, but nothing that matched his previous success. The fear of irrelevance that had plagued Dick Van Patten now haunted Goodeve, who was still young enough to want more from his career, but finding fewer and fewer doors open to him. As the years passed through the 1980s and beyond, Goodeve made peace with never achieving stardom again by transitioning into voice work and hosting, including a long stint as the host of the home improvement show Home Time. He built a stable, if unspectacular, career away from the camera, but the transition required letting go of dreams he'd once held. He watched from the sidelines as former castmates like Adam Rich and Lenny O'Grady self-destructed, grateful that he hadn't succumbed to similar demons, but also wondering if his own quiet acceptance of diminished circumstances represented its own form of defeat. The disappointment of unrealized potential became a constant companion, even as he maintained the appearance of contentment. Grant Goodeve is still alive at 72 years old, living a life far removed from the television fame he once knew. He continues to work in voice acting and occasionally appears at nostalgia conventions, where fans still want to meet David Bradford. His tragedy is not one of death or addiction, but of watching dreams quietly die while maintaining a dignified exterior, of accepting that the industry you loved didn't love you back quite enough. A melancholy fate for someone who did everything right, avoided scandal, maintained professionalism, tried to diversify his career, only to discover that sometimes doing everything right still isn't enough to sustain the dream. He survived, but survival came at the cost of ambition, leaving him to wonder in quiet moments what might have been if the spotlight had shone just a little longer. Nearly 45 years later, Eight is Enough remains a treasured family drama that defined an era of wholesome television. Yet the real lives behind it are far more tragic than any on-screen crisis Tom Bradford ever navigated. From Diana Hyland's devastating death before the show even found its audience, to Lonnie O'Grady's lonely overdose decades later, to Adam Rich's heartbreaking end in 2023, the cast was marked by losses that no script could have prepared them for. From mental illness to addiction, from forgotten careers to the slow death of dreams, every member of this television family carried stories the cameras never captured. Willie Ames sleeping in his car, Lonnie O'Grady dying alone in a mobile home, Adam Rich unable to escape the ghost of little Nicholas Bradford. These were not the happy endings ABC promised viewers each week. These were real people whose fame became a trap, whose success was fleeting, and whose struggles remind us that behind every beloved character is a human being fighting battles we'll never see. Which journey struck you the most? Comment below and don't forget to subscribe as we uncover the forgotten truths behind Hollywood's greatest legends.